It was supposed to be an ordinary night. December in East Texas brings a kind of quiet that settles over the pine trees like a blanket. The roads stretch dark and still beneath an endless sky. It's the kind of landscape where nothing unexpected ever seems to happen. But that illusion was shattered for 3 people in the small town of Huffman, not far from Houston. Betty Cash, a local business owner, Vickie Landrum, her close friend, and Vickie's young grandson, Colby. They weren't chasing anything. They weren't looking for mysteries or signs in the sky. All they wanted was to get home. But on that night, their journey was interrupted by something so strange, so searingly real, it would change their lives forever. What they encountered wasn't just a light in the distance. It was a structured, glowing object, hovering above the road, releasing bursts of flame and heat so intense that it burned the skin on their faces and hands. The craft was massive, shaped like a diamond with a bright blue center, and it hung in the air with a weight that defied explanation. They weren't alone either. In the distance, military helicopters, dozens of them, swarmed the skies, silent at first, then roaring overhead. It felt like the military was trying to contain something, or someone, or perhaps chasing a technology the public wasn't supposed to see. After the encounter, all 3 would suffer intense physical symptoms: burns, hair loss, nausea, skin lesions. Medical records documented their injuries. But when they asked for answers, when they turned to the Air Force and the government for an explanation, the doors slammed shut. And so they did something few in UFO history have dared to do. They took legal action. They filed a lawsuit against the United States government, alleging exposure to something it either created or failed to protect them from. But justice never came. This is UFO Zone, and this is the story of the Cash-Landrum encounter, burned by the unknown. The date was December 29th, 1980. Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and 7-year-old Colby Landrum were returning home after a quiet evening out. The trio had driven to a small town near New Caney, Texas for dinner and were now headed back to Dayton, where they lived. As they moved along Farm to Market Road 1485, a winding 2-lane stretch that cuts through the Texas countryside, they noticed something strange in the sky ahead. At first, it looked like a bright light, larger than a star, brighter than an aircraft. It hovered in the distance, slowly descending, pulsing orange and red. Within moments, the light resolved into a structured craft. It was shaped like a diamond, broad at the top and bottom, narrowing slightly in the center, with a blue glow radiating from its core. The object wasn't just passing overhead. It was hovering, directly over the road, blocking their path. The heat began almost immediately. The air inside the car grew unbearably hot. Betty reached for the door handle and stepped outside, hoping to get a better look, and perhaps, irrationally, to cool down. But outside was worse. The heat was intense, like standing near an open oven, radiating from the craft in thick waves. Then came the helicopters. Out of the night sky, a thunderous roar emerged. Helicopters, not 1 or 2, but at least 24, descended from above the tree line. The craft slowly lifted and moved forward, flames still blasting downward. It crossed the road and disappeared into the forest, with the helicopters swarming behind it. The entire encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but what followed would last a lifetime. As the craft disappeared into the woods, chased by a sky full of helicopters, the silence inside the car was deafening. Betty gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. Vickie held Colby close, trying to comfort him as he shook and sobbed. The car felt like an oven. The dashboard was hot to the touch, and the vinyl interior radiated heat like it had been left under a desert sun. Betty turned the key in the ignition. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, mercifully, the engine turned over. The car creaked forward, its headlights cutting through the smoky air as they crawled down the road, desperate to get home. But as they drove, none of them could stop glancing toward the sky. The object, the diamond-shaped craft with its blast of flame, was gone, swallowed by the forest and the night. But the helicopters could still be heard, their rhythmic chopping growing fainter in the distance. When they reached Betty's house, they parted ways. Vickie and Colby went home to their trailer nearby. Betty, exhausted and dazed, went straight to bed. That's when the symptoms began. By morning, all three were sick. Betty awoke with her head pounding, her eyes burned. Her skin, especially on her face and neck, was red and inflamed, as if sunburned, but worse. Nausea came in waves. She couldn't keep food down. Her hair was falling out in clumps, her scalp raw and sore. She was weak, barely able to stand. Vickie experienced similar symptoms, though less severe. Her face was blistered. Her eyes swelled shut. Her arms, exposed through the car windows, had developed strange welts and lesions. Even young Colby, despite being shielded under the dashboard, suffered from vomiting diarrhea and temporary blindness in one eye. His eyes were so swollen that he could barely open them. By the second day, Betty's condition worsened dramatically. She was rushed to the hospital. Doctors were baffled. They treated her for radiation-like burns, but there was no known source. No X-ray exposure. No industrial accident. No sun damage. Her symptoms mimicked acute radiation sickness. But without a cause, the diagnosis went nowhere. Betty remained hospitalized for weeks. Her skin began to peel. Sores formed along her scalp and arms. Her hair continued to fall out. Her immune system was collapsing. The doctors asked her again and again. What happened? She told them. She told them everything. The strange craft, the heat, the flames, the helicopters. Some listened, some didn't. And the military, they weren't listening at all. In the days that followed the encounter, Betty, Vickie, and Colby were left not only with debilitating symptoms, but also with a gnawing sense of confusion. What had they really seen? And more importantly, who had sent those helicopters? Neither woman had ever seen anything like the craft before. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a blimp. It hovered without wings, rotated slightly in the air, and spewed fire from below in rhythmic bursts. The structure was clearly mechanical, not a ball of light or a weather phenomenon. Betty would later describe it as looking like two ice cream cones stuck together at the wide ends. A diamond shape, glowing blue in the center, with a metallic sheen around the edges. But even more disturbing than the craft itself was the military presence. The helicopters hadn't been a trick of the light. They had been real, unmistakable, and everywhere. Some were clearly CH-47 Chinooks, large twin-rotor helicopters typically used by the U.S. Army. Others were smaller, darting across the sky in patterns that suggested a coordinated operation. Vickie counted at least 23 helicopters. Betty said it could have been more. And yet, there was no news coverage, no official acknowledgement, no reports of training exercises, no warnings issued to the public. When Vickie began calling around, trying to get answers, she hit a wall of silence. She contacted nearby military bases, Ellington Field, Fort Hood, Bergstrom Air Force Base. Every one of them denied any involvement. No flights were scheduled that night. No helicopters were deployed. No operations were conducted. Nothing happened, they said. But something had happened. The Landrum's car, a 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass, still bore the marks of the event. The dashboard was cracked from the heat. The metal trim on the doors had warped slightly. The windshield had small pits in the glass, as if from thermal stress. Betty even reported that the paint on the hood had begun to peel. They weren't alone in their confusion. Over the next few weeks, other witnesses began to surface. people who had been driving near the area that night and saw the strange object or the helicopters. One police officer reported seeing a formation of military helicopters flying over Lake Houston. A pilot claimed he saw an unusual glowing object near Crosby. A local oil worker described hearing something huge overhead, followed by a wall of rotor blades. Despite these independent confirmations, no government agency stepped forward to investigate. So Betty and Vickie kept pushing. They filed official reports. They contacted local newspapers. They spoke with UFO researchers. Eventually, the story reached the desks of civilian investigators, people like John Schuessler of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, who documented the physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, and began assembling a case file. The Cash-Landrum incident was becoming something more than a strange encounter. It was becoming a legal battle. By early 1981, just weeks after the incident, Betty Cash had already been hospitalized multiple times. Her symptoms showed no signs of improvement. She had lost most of her hair. Her eyelids were inflamed. Open sores developed on her scalp and hands, and her weight had dropped significantly. The pain was constant, blistering headaches, nausea, and weakness that confined her to bed for days at a time. Vickie's condition, while less severe, was also alarming. Her grandson Colby suffered recurring eye irritation, emotional distress, and anxiety attacks anytime he was in a car at night. Medical professionals were baffled. The women's symptoms resembled radiation exposure, but there was no known event or source to explain it. Physicians treating Betty noted that her symptoms were consistent with exposure to microwave or ionizing radiation. Frustrated and running out of options, the women turned to the only avenue left, the legal system. In 1982, they filed a formal lawsuit against the United States government. The case was built on a simple but damning premise that they had been exposed to a dangerous, unidentified aerial craft. The suit demanded $20 million in damages. Attorney Peter Gersten, known for taking on cases involving government secrecy, agreed to represent them. The case drew national attention. For the first time, a UFO incident wasn't just a matter of belief or speculation. It was a matter of law. Military spokespeople testified that no helicopters had been in the area that night. The Defense Department claimed complete ignorance. The court, lacking concrete proof of ownership or origin, ultimately dismissed the case. Betty, Vickie, and Colby were left with their injuries, their trauma, and their silence, while the government moved on as if nothing had happened. After the lawsuit failed, Betty and Vickie were left in legal and medical limbo. But outside the courtroom, their story was gaining traction. John Schuessler, an aerospace engineer at McDonnell Douglas and a founding member of MUFON, became one of the lead civilian investigators. Official channels were no help. Fort Hood, located roughly 160 miles away, denied flying any helicopters that night. But eyewitness reports kept stacking up. A police officer driving near Lake Houston the same night as the encounter reported seeing more than 20 helicopters flying in formation. A local pilot, flying a Cessna that evening, said he observed a glowing object moving low and slow across the sky. Some of the helicopters were identified by silhouette: CH-47 Chinooks, UH-1 Hueys, and Bell 212S, all military grade. And yet, the military denied any coordinated flight that night. Investigators turned to another possible source of evidence: flight logs. But these, too, proved elusive. Requests filed through the Freedom of Information Act were returned with heavily redacted documents. It was as if the entire event had been wiped from the record. Still, Schuessler persisted. He even suggested that the craft might have been a secret experimental vehicle, possibly nuclear-powered. If it was one of ours, why deny it? And if it wasn't, why the helicopters? Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear: There was a concerted effort to erase, deflect, or deny any connection. To this day, no branch of the military has taken responsibility, and the wall of silence stands. Years passed, but the scars remained. Betty Cash never fully recovered from that night. Her health declined steadily over the next decade. She suffered from chronic fatigue, immune system disorders, and recurring skin infections. She passed away in 1998, nearly 18 years after the incident, never having received compensation, acknowledgement, or justice. Vickie Landrum lived longer but carried her trauma just as deeply. She never stopped insisting that what they saw that night was real. What frightened her most was the silence from those who knew more. Colby, the youngest of the three, grew up haunted by what he witnessed. Even as an adult, he found it difficult to drive at night, especially down dark country roads. Meanwhile, interest in the Cash-Landrum incident continued to grow among researchers, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists alike. The case became a staple in documentaries, books, and investigative reports. Physical evidence, medical records, eyewitness accounts, government denial, and yet it never led to accountability. In 1995, the case resurfaced briefly when investigative journalist Linda Moulton Howe received new information. But even that lead went cold, buried under a pile of denials and retracted statements. No official explanation has ever been given. No military branch has stepped forward. The Cash-Landrum incident remains one of the most infuriating mysteries in the history of UFO encounters. 3 people were burned, sickened, and traumatized by something no one would take responsibility for. And the silence continues. What happened that night in the Texas woods was real. Something came down, something hot, heavy and humming with power. It wasn't a vague light in the sky. It wasn't a distant dot on a radar screen. It was a machine. It was close. And it left behind burned skin, broken trust, and lives forever altered. The witnesses never asked to become part of UFO history. They weren't believers. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when they turned to their government for help, they were met with silence. Maybe it was a secret project. Maybe it was something else entirely. But if the truth is ever revealed, it will come too late for those who suffered most. And maybe that's the point. This is UFO Zone.